Welcome back. We're about to start the general discussion portion of the program, and I'll ask for the first question from our own Blacksburg audience, please.
I would like to ask Dr. Abramson, what is being done by the government, the EPA, to lessen the poisonous effects of pesticides on grape workers and their families in California?
We're in the process of issuing new regulations for worker safety, which have a variety of new requirements which were hotly debated over the last 3 years with the industry and the public. It will require the availability of water locally for wash-off in emergency spills, posting in multiple languages for workers, particularly grape workers who are migrants quite often. The new set of regulations will cost the industry a great deal, but we feel that they are necessary to increase the level of protection that we provide to those workers.
From Mississippi State University for Dr. Remmers, and the comment is, when you give information on pesticides and cancer risks, you should show the cancer risks over time, that one would not expect to see immediate cancers in children, but you might see them later on based on childhood exposure. Do you have a comment on that?
Yes. In the studies, we take a look at the long-term cancer risk. And as it's well known, to get a good full-blown case of lung cancer, it takes 20 to 30 years of 3 to 4 packs a day. And the same thing applies to other carcinogens in our environment.
Next question, this gentleman.
Yes. Doing some research about 40 or 50 miles outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. I ran into a farmer's wife who was probably growing up in the 20s and 30s, and they were not using pesticides. They instead basically scraped the bugs off the leaves and killed them, or aphids, or whatever they were doing. And she commented that she did not notice as big a problem with things such as Colorado potato beetles as we currently have in the area. And I was wondering if this could be related, how much of this could be related to pests migrating in, and how much of it could be related to the pests developing an immune system. And are we in essence creating another problem of increased insect populations?
Well, there certainly is a major problem with the movement and importation of foreign pests, not just within our country, but internationally. And the reliance on chemical pesticides as a sole method of control often has the impact of killing a lot of the beneficial and predatory insects that have helped over the generations keep a balance. So there are many, many instances where we do in fact know that excessive reliance on one type of control method, and often chemical pesticides, will lead to a resurgence of secondary pests that never really were much of a problem. This is an issue that's being addressed by scientists really around the world.
There's also the consideration that cropping practices in the area may have changed. And that is, as the potato beetle exists on certain plants, obviously, and not on others. And it may simply have not been abundant in the area, but have moved in with a change in cropping practices, or because somebody shipped something in that had beetles on it, and they then established a larger colony. There are any number of things that could have happened.
We have a question here for anyone on the panel from Annette Stanley at Blackhawk Technology in Janesville, Wisconsin. She wants to know, she has many questions, I've just selected one. Why does the FDA discourage use of predatory insects, specifically in grain warehouses? Anybody want to tackle that?
The FDA has been reluctant to approve the use of some predatory insects for the control of other insects in stored grains. And the reason the FDA has done that is because under the U.S. Department of Agriculture's grain standards program, there's very strict standards for insect parts per hundredweight of grain. And this is an example of where one agency, the FDA, bears a certain responsibility for making a decision, and the USDA has other responsibilities, and the two agencies are trying to sort out how to change current regulatory policies as well as grading standards to accommodate some of the new biological methods that are emerging for the control of insects in stored grain, which is a very serious concern, because when pesticides are used post-harvest on foods in storage, that tends to be much closer to the point where the consumer is going to possibly be exposed to the pesticide. So as Bill pointed out, if we really want to focus where the problems might be most significant, the use of pesticide post-harvest in stored products is certainly one of the most important places to start.
Okay, question here in Blacksburg.
My question, I suppose, is directed at both Dr. Thorne and Dr. Lawrence. And I wonder if you could comment on the ethical issue of the manufacture and marketing of pesticides in third world countries, which have been banned in this country.
I'll start the comment. Undoubtedly, there are ethical issues that have to be considered and are considered when products that are banned in the United States are shipped to other countries, whether they be third world countries or countries that are just farming in a different way. The consideration has to be one of both benefits and risks, though, because we're here in the United States, we have an excellent standard of living, we have an awful lot of time and money to consider removal of extremely small risks in our society. I mean, we're discussing airbags versus seatbelts and things like that in cars. You get into other countries where they're just trying to survive, and the mortality rate of infants is many, many, many times higher than in the United States. They're faced with plagues of locusts and other insects. They're plagued with diseases because of tropical and subtropical climates that we don't face in many cases. They're also faced with unsophisticated farming methods. They don't have the equipment and the technology that we have for either growing, harvesting, or storage of crops. And under those circumstances, they're looking for answers. They're looking for survival. And in some cases, the only products that will work, the only products that will kill the insects, prevent the diseases, and stop the weeds from taking over the crops, perhaps are products that either are presently banned in the United States because a new product is out that is safer, breaks down faster, or used at a lower use rate, or perhaps products that have been replaced with higher technology in the United States, but yet are still available in other countries because they are so inexpensive and the regulations haven't been established. There's no excuse for not looking at the health and safety aspects of it, but where there's a demand for the products in foreign countries, those products will generally be sold. I defer to other people too.
John, I completely agree with everything you said. I'd just add a little bit to it, which is that first of all, any simple profligate dumping of American products on those other folks, of course, is an unethical and immoral thing and shouldn't happen. I don't think that much happens, although that's something I've never looked into myself. I generally understand that very little of that really happens. Second, when other countries are on the market or come to United States AID or other agencies asking for assistance in this area, decisions made ought to be very judicious and weighing risks, benefits, and costs, and trying to minimize the risks, both to that local exposed population and the global population in the long run. So again, be smart about which pesticides are applied. But I must say that John's right. People's equations are very, very different, and many countries have enormous problems that we are just fortunate not to have to face. And I think it's just as wrong to deny people benefits of some kinds of pest control agents. I don't want to defend all pesticides, but to simply say they don't have right of self-determination seems to me very wrong in an international world. I also don't think that third world leaders and scientists are stupid. And I see a lot of evidence that they're trying to become much better at making these decisions, screening their choices, and making commitments that make sense for them.
Here's another aspect of this that I'd just like to comment on quickly, which is that in one sense, in this very complex equation, we can see pesticides used in other countries which then come back into this country in terms of imports. And a lot of hue and cry has been raised recently regarding the question of the quality assurance, making sure that the residues on the imports are at least as low as the residues that we impose upon our own growers. That's a competitive thing, and I think can be fixed relatively easily through improvements in our import monitoring programs. But in that same chain of taking in crops from other countries, which then compete locally, there's an interesting ethical question in terms of the restrictions we place on our own growers versus the restrictions on the growers and pesticide users in other countries. And if we allow the crops to be treated with pesticides which are severely restricted and banned in the United States, allow those crops to come into the United States, aren't we then in effect ethically exporting the risk to the local users in order for us to gain the benefit of importing the crops? I think this is a significant ethical question that has not been dealt with adequately.
We have a question that has come in from Elizabeth Iglesias in Kaufman, Texas, and it's for Dr. Abramson. She'd like you to address the issue of chlordane and heptachlor, the whole array of organochlorines, specifically effects on groundwater degradation and chronic low-level exposures, especially mothers and infants.
Well, from a regulatory perspective, most of those compounds have left the marketplace. There are not new introductions, but because of their persistence, particularly chlordane, in urban areas, we have for many years been developing increasing evidence that urban runoff has significant amounts of chlordane and related compounds. We're beginning to see it in fish tissue studies in some of our major inland rivers, such as the Missouri River in the United States. So it's a situation where the presence of the compound has been restricted for the future, but we have to catch up with the problems of the past because they are so persistent, and there's not much we can do in terms of control anymore. It's a matter of, once it's out in the environment, making sure we monitor the occurrence, trying to prohibit use of fish in certain rivers where the levels in the flesh are potentially dangerous, and making sure that the trend is in fact in the long run downward so that we can see that the environment will clean itself.
Here's a question that's indicated for Dr. Lawrence, but I think perhaps Dr. Remmers might want to have a shot at it as well. The question is, could you comment on risk-benefit analyses which depend on mortality, death, rather than morbidity statistics or illness statistics for human health? Dr. Lawrence, you start.
It's a difficult question. I think we have to look at both morbidity and mortality. I don't see how to decide in advance. I think we ought to use every bit of evidence we have on any question, from the animal tests to illness to death. Modern life is afflicted with meets so many different risks, most of which are additive or subtractive or somehow add up to our long-term health, that rarely do we see a single cause leading to a single effect. And I think the only thing that's wrong is the crude and simplistic analyses that say, you know, more people are getting cancer and more people are being exposed to this or that, and therefore this is causing the cancer. I think that kind of illogic is unscientific and shouldn't be pursued. But I think we have to use the illness statistics and the death statistics to the greatest extent that makes sense.
Yes, I basically agree. Certainly the statistics on mortality are much more available. When you get into things like disabilities and illness, disease, there the statistics become of a much lower quality. So certainly we would want to use all of the data that are available.
Question from Nancy Barnhart at Shenandoah College in Winchester. She asks, one of the results of high pesticide use is the ability to grow near perfect fruit. She wants to know if anyone on the panel thinks consumer acceptance of less perfect fruit will actually result in less pesticide use. Any prognosticators here?
Well, excuse me. First of all, I think that one of the hopeful developments that's addressed in considerable length in our report is that consumers probably aren't going to be faced with a choice between pesticide-laden fruit and fruit that's full of wormholes. They're some of the most attractive produce that consumers encounter today has no pesticide residues on it and has in fact been grown with a IPM or organic system that results in no residues and no damage. So I think that there are those that claim that stricter pesticide regulation is going to result in a substantial change in the cosmetic appeal and quality of the fresh fruit and vegetables that are available to the consumer. And there's no scientific evidence or basis to predict that being true. In fact, there's been tremendous progress in just the last decade in producing fresh fruits and vegetables in major production areas with sophisticated biological systems that rely somewhat on pesticides, particularly when an unusual weather pattern might evolve or where an imported pest is brought in. I mean, at this very moment as we speak, Los Angeles is being sprayed once again with malathion to control the medfly. The reason they're doing that is they don't want that pest to get established in the southern part of California's agricultural industry, because if that pest becomes established, the pesticide applications that will be required will disrupt the biocontrol and IPM systems that have been developed at great expense, both to the growers and the citizens of the state of California through their land-grant universities. So I think that people should be very skeptical about those who contend that a stark choice is going to have to be made here between cosmetically perfect fruit and damaged fruit, because I think that there's no reason for that to occur, and indeed I don't think it will.
One further reflection on that as well. You have to keep in mind that pesticides are used in the production of fruits and vegetables across this country, and you look at the data on market basket surveys of actual residues on the fruit and on the vegetables in the stores, and they are very low or non-existent under current production schemes. Now, certainly biologicals and IPM and other things are very important and have a place in the future production of agricultural products that we use in our diet. But we have to keep in mind as well that the current food supply is very safe. The residues are either non-existent or low enough to be within tolerance at least 95 to 98% of the time, based upon the statistics that I've seen. And when I go to the grocery store and I'm looking at this food that has been treated during its growth cycle with pesticides, but I do know, based upon the statistics that I've seen, that it's probably does have no residue on it, I see the homemaker, and I do it myself, picking through hundreds of green beans, hundreds of strawberries, tens of tomatoes, looking for the one perfect one. Now, if that's the case under current situation, what's it going to be when we cut back by a half or three-quarters under IPM or other production schemes, the amount of pesticides that we use?
Here's another question for Dr. Abramson. In fact, it's my question for Dr. Abramson. In recent years, the EPA has changed from a zero-tolerance rule to the current negligible risk standard that I believe is less than 1 extra cancer in 1 million people over a lifetime. We hear talk of a new Bush administration proposal to go to a still more flexible standard in some cases of allowing less than 1 extra cancer in 100,000. Is this in fact a serious proposal, and on what basis is this change to a less strict standard being made?
It is in fact a serious proposal. The dilemma that was posed is with respect to carcinogenic materials and the Delaney Clause in terms of food additives, and that is it's a zero-risk standard, and under the existing legislation, whereas the federal pesticide law requires us to do a risk-benefit balancing, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act requires us to take no benefits into account and ban these substances. The dilemma led to a National Academy of Sciences study and a recommendation that we adopt this negligible risk standard. Now, as I indicated in my presentation, the question is, what is negligible? As a term of art over the years, most people have become familiar with 1 in 1 million over a lifetime, and the thought of going to 1 in 100,000 becomes very difficult to accept. That's a tenfold increase. What is EPA doing, proposing this seriously? The answer is, under our legislation, there are some cases where there may not be an effective alternative to a pesticide, where the benefits may be so significant that in fact we wish to incur the additional risk, that there is a net societal gain by having that pesticide in continued use at a slightly higher risk than the society would incur if we banned that pesticide. We think in those limited number of cases, and we expect those to be extremely small, we will go through a public process of disclosing our analysis and hope that we will make those wise decisions in those cases where we really think we need to incur the extra risk to obtain the benefits.
I'd like to just comment briefly that, believe it or not, in Washington sometimes some rational things happen. Over the last 10 years, in all of our major environmental laws and the major environmental programs administered by the Food and Drug Administration, the EPA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and other regulatory agencies, there's been a convergence on a 1 in a million standard as that level of risk below which the government really feels it's unwarranted to take any steps to further reduce risk. And in cases when risks appear to be above that level, a variety of remedial steps are taken, which might include more monitoring and studies to determine whether there's a real risk there, to fairly aggressive regulatory actions. And the current proposal by the Bush administration in the area of pesticides is one of several new proposals on how to define and deal with negligible risk. In California, there'll be a new proposition on the ballot in that state in November of next year that proposes basically going to a zero risk standard for pesticides that are shown to cause cancer in animals. So the debate about what level of risk is acceptable is going on at all levels of government and in all areas of society, but there is a fairly clear pattern of accepting 10 to the minus 6 as the tolerable level of risk. In our 1987 Academy report on pesticide residues in food, which Dr. Abramson mentioned, we recommended to the agency that if they consistently adhered to a 10 to the minus 6 standard for pesticide residues in food, they could eliminate 95+% of the current risk in the food supply while all the additional science and new research on improved pest control techniques were being done. And I think that's the quandary that the EPA is in right now. Do they take action over the next few years to try to eliminate the larger chunk of risk that most people acknowledge is there and over this 10 to the minus 6 level, or do they wait for more complete data and a more thorough airing of the public policy issues?
Thank you. From our audience?
Yes, I have a question for Dr. Lawrence that goes back to a comment that Dr. Abramson made. Dr. Abramson made a comment about risk assessment, and he sort of threw it back in the public's eye, and that is to say that you ought to believe the EPA were somewhat creditable in certain situations. We may not be in others. In the end, the public has to make a risk assessment of their own. And my question would be, under the existing conditions, as I understand it, how can we teach the public to do risk assessment when, for example, it would be illegal under EPA standards to register a peanut butter and jelly sandwich as a pesticide because of the natural levels of aflatoxin and formaldehyde that are in a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? How can we ask the public to make an acceptable risk assessment under the conditions where things that the public perceives to be totally safe are actually quite risky, whereas things that can't be, whereas things that we register as pesticides perceived by the public appear to be quite risky?
It's a very important and very difficult question. It's one that I keep chipping away at, don't find any easy answer to. First, on the term risk assessment itself, I don't think you meant the scientific part. Certainly the public can't make its own scientific judgments. Even though I'm trained in the sciences, I'm very cautious about thinking I can redo the work of epidemiologists or structural engineers or seismologists in assessing the risk. What I have to trust in is our institutions that oversee those processes and hope it gets done right. Doesn't always, but that's, so on the science, I think we don't expect people to do their own. To the extent that they want to become informed, brief themselves on the techniques and go through the logic of the analysis, they certainly should. It's a very interesting thing to do. Everything that you're exposed to in your life, from air pollution to your automobile to pesticide residues in your food. On the issue of sort of how people perceive and decide whether or not to accept something, I think we really have a long and neglected, so far neglected campaign of education. I think forums of this kind can indirectly be helpful. I understand there are courses at Virginia Tech that begin to get at some of these kinds of questions. I really think we have to develop a much clearer sense of the relative risk in different areas of life, because we're taking them all on at one time. we're worrying about all of them at one time, and we see that there are some major, clear, substantial risks: hurricanes, earthquakes, and a very long list of other things. And I'd say that the challenge, one of the biggest challenges for our society in the next years, and I don't think it'll take just a few years, but is to accomplish this goal of getting a better comparative sense of the risks that we face.
One further comment on that, if I might. I think it's all of our responsibility to require or expect from the media, newspaper, television, radio, that the reporting that they do is not sensationalistic, that it's balanced, that they check their sources, and that they request documentation for things they're going to publish whenever possible from both sides of the story. Because I think we don't have to look too far back this year, and we can see some clear examples of where the public, in their quest for understanding of the risks that they face in their normal life, was misled by sensationalistic reporting, and it required joint reports by the FDA, USDA, and EPA stating, yeah, our food is safe, before this whole furor over the food safety died down. Part of the work that I do is dealing with the media, trying to provide them information in advance, so when something on the issue of water quality comes up, they'll be prepared to act responsibly. However, they're always facing short deadlines. They have problems with tracing down sources of information. So I think it's all of our responsibility to expect from the media responsible reporting. And in that regard, it'll help us understand the risks we face in everyday life.
Could I just comment? Could I add to that? Another way to get at it is to look at the end result first, that is cancer or heart disease or cirrhosis of the liver, and say, what are the things that contribute to cirrhosis of the liver, for example, and then work back from that to the major causes and therefore the targets of public action or personal attention. And we do that also, but that's another way that we get at the big ones rather than the unimportant ones.
I have to make 2 points, or at least I'd like to try to make 2 points. One is that while I dream of a fully responsible, objective, well-informed media, I really don't expect it. I think that they have their own business problems to deal with, and one thrives on controversy rather than quiet debate in academic circles. So I think that those of us who are engaged in the process of managing risk on behalf of the public have to assume that it's really our responsibility to articulate our programs and our judgments in the best possible way so as to minimize the possibility of misinterpretation and sensational reporting by the media. I'm not sure that I, as a public servant, have the right to expect the media to do that for me. The other point I want to make is that risk management, as distinguished from the scientific risk assessment process, ultimately, in my opinion, is not truly a scientific endeavor. I'll give you one obvious example that we haven't really mentioned yet today, but I think is quite important, and that is the level of risk that you as an individual are would be willing to accept is significantly different depending upon whether you think it's a voluntarily assumed risk, your choice, or an involuntarily assumed risk, my choice imposed upon you. And in fact, the difference in the numbers at the end of the public policy debate, hinging upon this distinction between voluntary and involuntarily assumed risk, can often be 1,000, 10,000, or 1,000,000 times different, and it's strictly a psychological and personal decision that's involved. It's not susceptible to science, but it is a reality in terms of our political and public decision-making process.
Our consumer education published a booklet recently on the 10 leading causes of premature preventable death in the United States. And when you take a look at the list, it's not big government failing to protect its citizens, and it's not big business that is trying to poison Americans. It's basically individuals having to make decisions about their own lifestyle factors. Lifestyle factors such as tobacco use, alcohol use, hard drug use, various sexual and reproductive behaviors, whether you're going to use a seatbelt when you drive 75 miles an hour down Interstate 81, whether you have a smoke detector in your home, and whether you have a working evacuation plan so that people know how to leave your home in the event of a fire. These are the leading causes of premature preventable death in the United States, and they have nothing to do with big government trying to protect us or big industry trying to kill us. It's your decision. I'll be happy to give you a copy of our report if you're interested.
Here's a question for Dr. Dunlap. What is the most important issue at present involving pesticide use and wildlife management?
That would depend very much on which wildlife biologist you talk to. I would really hesitate at this point to say the biggest problem, the problem in fact that involved wildlife biologists in the whole matter was DDT. And many of them mobilized very much against DDT and the persistent pesticides because of the sort of problem they caused. Since then, there has been no single problem which has so mobilized the crew. And while there are various concerns, probably the one which in many ways involves most is that of pesticides in fresh water, particularly the contamination of fish and the various problems involved with the disruption of aquatic ecosystems, which in many cases are extremely sensitive to what seem to be very small areas.
Okay, a question for Dr. Abramson. What is the present status of LR? There's been a scare in this area. Was it real or was it more media hype than reality?
Yes, no, and maybe. Current status of ALAR is that it has been removed from the marketplace. It is not being used in the United States. There may be some pockets of residual supplies around that people are using without our knowledge, but we think it's effectively dead as a chemical in the market. Now, whether or not it was a serious issue then jumps right into the question of how was the information managed, what did EPA do, did not do, were we responsible? The position we were trying to articulate is that based on data which we received starting as early as 1984, we had some concerns about cancer induction through residues present on apples. We asked external scientific review bodies to agree with us, and they said they didn't think the evidence was conclusive. We should go back and get more studies. So we did. We went back and requested more studies, which took several years to obtain. We were in the process of reviewing those studies when the NRDC went public with its report and essentially caught us in the middle of our regulatory process. The position we were taking was that if we had to make a decision at that time, several months ago, based on the data, we would move to cancel the product, but we did not feel it was ready to cancel because we wanted to have the full set of scientific data in-house to review. Then the attack came that if we had our suspicions, why didn't we act? And that is a question of when you think you have enough to pull the trigger on the gun versus disrupting an entire industry in the country with the social dislocation that that involves. And we felt we were doing what was responsible. It was pretty clear that large segments of the public felt that what we were doing was not rapid enough or responsible.
We feel that regulatory action should be based on science and not on public perception. Unfortunately, in our country these days, we're now relying on public opinion polls rather than solid science. If you take a look at the data on LR, there's no evidence since it was introduced in about 1963 that it has ever caused any harm to humans. If you take a look at the rat data, there's no evidence that LR causes cancer to either low-dose or high-dose rats. If you take a look at the data on mice, in the low-dose mouse experiments, there's no evidence that LR causes cancer. If you take a look at the high-dose mouse experiments with LR, when you give LR at a level where the mice stop drinking water and stop eating food, only then, after you've reached an extreme toxic state, that you run into cancer. And as the EPA Scientific Advisory Board said, you should you should reject those studies whenever you exceed the maximum tolerated dose in any of these so-called bioassay studies. And we were very, very disappointed that strong, firm toxicological principles were thrown out the window, and we allowed, in essence, a lynch mob to get LR off of the market. We feel that this is a very, very dangerous precedent to set in the United States, because it's only going to encourage future lynch mobs to get chemicals off of the market in the United States. And we feel that they should be allowed on the market on a very, very firm scientific basis and get rid of this public perception. As I said before, we need to improve very drastically the quality of scientific education in the United States so that our public does not get swept off its feet as it did with the LR scare. Whenever you see a Hollywood character turned into a toxicologist overnight, or a TV anchorman, or one of the so-called ultra-liberal public relations firms promoting a scare the way they did and issuing a report that was published about a month ago, or at least parts of it, in the Wall Street Journal, you can very quickly realize that solid, peer-reviewed mainstream science was not being brought to bear. We had a lynch mob.
Dr. Remmers, you used Walter Cronkite in your organization to, in the Big Fears, Little Risks program. Isn't that some of the same use of personalities to convey messages?
Perhaps, but we were doing it on a different basis, on a totally different level.
I believe it's in our Blacksburg audience.
The question I have is not whether LR is good or bad. Let's suppose for the moment that it was proven scientifically to an unbiased panel of scientists that it really was a sensationalism that made our LR be pulled off the market. You mentioned a proposed law or something where there would be legal repercussions to that particular people that I think paid publicity people to start the LR thing. Is that right?
One 30-second answer.
Senator Steve Sims from Idaho, who happens to be a third-generation apple grower, has sponsored this legislation that will permit so-called toxic terrorists who disparage America's food supply to sue those people who create the food supply. And we hope that Steve Sims' legislation will pass.
Well, I'm sorry we don't have time for more questions. Many have come in. We can't address them. I want to thank our speakers and our audience for a very informative and spirited discussion. We've identified the choices. We've tried to wrestle with some of the challenges. And I hope these discussions will continue on well past the close of this teleconference. For the PBS Adult Learning Satellite Service and the Choices and Challenges Project, good afternoon.